In 2024, the world consumed more silver than it mined, not by a little, by over 200 million ounces. And here's the uncomfortable part. That wasn't a one-time event. It's been happening for 3 consecutive years. Above-ground stockpiles are shrinking. Production isn't keeping up. And the industries that depend on silver, solar panels, EVs, electronics, medical devices, aren't slowing down. They're accelerating. So what happens when demand for a metal becomes structurally greater than supply? History has an answer. And it's never been orderly. Because this isn't just about a commodity. It's about what happens when the foundation of modern technology begins to crack. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where money, power, and history quietly shape the world around us. Because what's unfolding in silver markets right now isn't just about commodity prices or mining statistics. It's about what happens when the world builds its future on a resource it can't replace fast enough. And what that means for the balance of power in the decades ahead. Silver sits in a category almost no other material occupies. It's the most electrically conductive metal on Earth, the most thermally conductive, the most reflective, one of the best antimicrobial agents in nature. And it's absolutely essential to technologies we've decided are non-negotiable. Green energy infrastructure, 5G networks, military electronics, medical equipment, water purification systems. Unlike gold, which is mostly hoarded in vaults and jewelry, silver gets used up, consumed, destroyed, dispersed into products too small or too cheap to economically recycle. In 2023 alone, industrial demand consumed over 600 million ounces of silver. Solar panels accounted for nearly 20% of that figure. Electric vehicles took another growing slice. Electronics, medicine, water purification, photography. The applications span nearly every sector of the modern economy. And here's where the tension begins. Global mine production that same year delivered just under 830 million ounces. Do the math. The gap between what we extract from the earth and what we consume in industry is closing fast. Investment demand, jewelry, silverware, they add to the total. And when you factor in everything, total silver demand exceeded 1 billion ounces in 2023. The deficit was covered by drawing down existing stockpiles, inventories built over decades, reserves held by governments, exchanges, and private holders. But those stockpiles aren't infinite. What no one's talking about yet is what happens when the deficit becomes permanent, when there's nothing left to draw down. For most of modern history, silver supply wasn't a concern anyone lost sleep over. When demand rose, miners found more, new veins opened in Mexico, operations expanded in Peru, technology improved, economies of scale kicked in. The assumption was straightforward and seemingly logical. Silver is abundant. It exists in the Earth's crust at roughly 0.08 parts per million. There's always more to find. The planet is big. Human ingenuity is bigger. But here's what that optimistic logic fundamentally missed. Most silver doesn't come from silver mines. It comes as a byproduct, extracted alongside copper, lead, zinc, and gold. Roughly 70% of global silver production is tied to the economics of completely different metals. Think about what that means. When copper prices drop, copper mines slow production or close, even if silver prices are rising. When a zinc mine shuts down for environmental violations, its silver output disappears too. When gold deposits are exhausted, the accompanying silver vanishes from the supply chain. Silver supply, in other words, isn't primarily driven by silver demand. It's driven by the profitability of other metals. That structural dependence was never a problem when industrial demand for silver was modest, when the primary uses were coins, jewelry, photography, and some niche electronics. But in the early 2000s, something fundamental shifted. The world started electrifying at scale. Solar installations went from experimental rooftop panels to utility-scale farms covering square miles. The smartphone revolution put advanced electronics in billions of pockets. And then came the green energy transition, a civilizational bet on technologies that happened to be extraordinarily silver-intensive. By 2010, industrial demand for silver had overtaken investment demand. By 2020, it dominated the entire market structure. Silver had quietly transformed from a precious metal to a critical industrial commodity. And here's the problem with that transformation. Industrial users don't hoard. They consume. Every ounce that goes into a solar panel is functionally gone. It's spread across a rooftop in a thin layer, embedded in silicon and glass, economically impractical to recover. Every ounce in a smartphone gets shipped worldwide, used for a few years, then tossed in a drawer or a landfill. The metal doesn't circulate back into supply the way gold does. It worked, but only under conditions that would not last Between 2010 and 2020, global silver demand grew by over 30%. Solar energy was the driving force behind that surge. A single solar panel contains roughly 20 grams of silver, used in photovoltaic cells to conduct electricity with minimal loss. Silver paste is applied in thin lines across the silicon wafer, forming the electrical contacts that capture and transport the current generated by sunlight. There's no perfect substitute. Engineers have tried. Copper is cheaper, but it corrodes. Aluminum doesn't conduct as efficiently. Silver's unique combination of conductivity, durability, and reliability makes it irreplaceable in high-efficiency panels. As countries committed to net zero carbon targets, solar installations surged. In 2010, the solar industry used about 30 million ounces of silver annually. By 2022, that number had more than quadrupled to over 140 million ounces. And the trajectory is still climbing, sharply. Electric vehicles followed a similar exponential curve. Each EV uses nearly twice the silver of a traditional internal combustion vehicle in electrical contacts, circuit boards, charging infrastructure, and battery management systems. A conventional car might use 15 to 30 grams of silver. An electric vehicle uses 25 to 50 grams. Multiply that by projected EV sales, expected to hit 40 million units annually by 2030. And you're looking at hundreds of millions of ounces in demand from automotive alone. Then came 5G networks, every new cell tower, every base station, every connected device, and the Internet of Things. All of them require silver contacts, switches, and conductors to handle high-frequency signals with minimal loss. On the surface, this looked like progress, clean energy, faster connectivity, a more electrified, efficient future. But each technological advancement locked in a structural dependency. And here's the unintended consequence that almost no one was tracking. Miners weren't keeping pace. New silver mine development takes between 10 and 15 years from discovery to production. You have to find the deposit, conduct exploration drilling, assess the economics, secure financing, navigate environmental reviews, obtain permits, build infrastructure. All of that takes time, enormous amounts of time. And over the past 2 decades, that timeline has only lengthened. Environmental regulations became more stringent. Community opposition increased. Permitting processes became more complex and politically fraught. Meanwhile, ore grades, the concentration of silver in rock, were declining at major deposits worldwide. By 2020, the average silver mine was extracting ore with 30% lower grades than a decade earlier. That means more energy consumed, more water used, more waste rock moved, more cost per ounce, for less metal. The economics were getting harder, and yet demand kept rising. Above-ground inventories absorbed the gap. Stockpiles built up over decades began to draw down, quietly and steadily. No alarms went off, no headlines screamed crisis, but the buffer was disappearing. The stronger demand became, the harder it was to stop. The first visible crack appeared in 2021. The Silver Institute, the industry's leading research organization, published a quiet but significant revision to its annual supply-demand forecast. Global silver markets had entered a structural deficit. Demand exceeded newly mined supply by 51 million ounces that year. Most analysts treated it as a blip. Supply chains were disrupted by COVID-19. Mines had shut down temporarily. Surely production would bounce back. It didn't. In 2022, the deficit widened to 237 million ounces, the second largest deficit on record. In 2023, it registered 184 million ounces. 3 consecutive years of drawdown. 3 years where the world consumed more silver than it pulled from the ground. Where did the missing silver come from? Existing stockpiles, COMEX inventories in New York, London vaults, government reserves accumulated during previous decades, recycled scrap from industrial waste and old electronics. But here's the problem. Above-ground inventories aren't infinite, and recycling silver from consumer electronics is expensive, often more costly than the metal is current market value. The quantities are tiny. The recovery process is complex. For most products, it's simply not economical. So the world was eating into reserves. The cushion, the strategic buffer that had always been there to smooth out temporary imbalances. Meanwhile, major mining executives began issuing warnings. In 2023, Michael Steinman, CEO of Pan American Silver, one of the world's largest primary silver producers, stated publicly that the industry was struggling to replace reserves. Exploration wasn't finding enough new deposits. Existing mines were depleting faster than new ones were coming online. Fresnillo, the world's top primary silver miner, reported declining output at its flagship operations in Mexico. Ore grades were falling, costs were rising. First Majestic Silver, another major producer, echoed the concerns. The company's CEO noted that permitting delays in Mexico had stretched to over 5 years for new projects. By the time approvals came through, economic conditions had often changed, making projects less viable. Exploration budgets across the industry weren't rising fast enough to offset depletion. Junior mining companies, the ones that typically discover new deposits, were struggling to raise capital. Investor interest had shifted toward tech and green energy stocks. Mining was out of favor. And critically, most new silver deposits being discovered were smaller, deeper, and harder to access than the giant mines developed in previous decades. The easy silver had already been found. Nothing collapsed. And that was the problem. Markets remained relatively calm. Silver prices fluctuated, but there was no panic, no emergency policy response, no headlines warning of scarcity. Because the deficit was being masked, papered over by depleting the very reserves that had always cushioned the gap between supply and demand. The system looked stable, but it was living on borrowed time. The inflection point isn't a single catastrophic event. It's a convergence of forces, all moving in the same direction. In 2024, solar demand alone is projected to consume over 200 million ounces of silver, nearly 25% of total global mine supply. Let that sink in. One industry, one application. A quarter of everything humanity digs out of the ground. The International Energy Agency forecasts that solar capacity will need to triple by 2030 to meet international climate commitments. If current silver intensity per panel holds steady, and research into silver reduction technologies hasn't yet achieved commercial scale, that would require an additional 150 million ounces annually above current levels. Add in electric vehicle growth. Global EV sales were 14 million units in 2023. Projections suggest they'll exceed 40 million by 2030. That's a tripling of automotive silver demand alone. Add in the expansion of 5G networks into rural and developing regions, the build-out of 6G infrastructure on the horizon, smart cities, industrial IoT, every connected sensor, every autonomous vehicle, every piece of modern infrastructure pulling on the same finite resource. And don't forget military electronics, where silver's conductivity and reliability are irreplaceable. Missile guidance systems, radar arrays, communication networks, electronic warfare systems. Military demand doesn't show up in public statistics, but defense analysts estimate it accounts for tens of millions of ounces annually, and it's growing as militaries worldwide modernize. Now, layer in the supply side. The reality, no amount of wishful thinking can change. Global mine production has plateaued. The Silver Institute project's production will remain essentially flat through 2028, hovering around 830 million ounces annually. Why? Because no major new mines are coming online fast enough to offset depletion at existing operations. Exploration success rates have fallen. The average time from discovery to first production now exceeds 12 years. By the time a deposit is found, evaluated, financed, permitted, and built, over a decade has passed, and during that decade, demand has grown exponentially. And here's the critical constraint. Because 70% of silver is a byproduct, its supply is held hostage to the economics of copper, zinc, and lead. If those markets soften, even temporarily due to a recession or policy shift, silver output contracts, regardless of silver's own price or demand dynamics. A copper mine doesn't increase production because silver prices doubled. It responds to copper prices. Silver just comes along for the ride. By 2025, some analysts estimate the structural deficit could exceed 300 million ounces annually. By 2028, if solar and EV growth continues on current trajectories, the deficit could approach 400 million ounces. At that scale, even the largest remaining stockpiles begin to look inadequate. From this point on, the outcome was no longer optional. When supply structurally can't meet demand, something has to give. Historically, that's meant substitution. Industries adapt, engineers innovate. Copper replaces silver in some applications, aluminum in others. Costs rise, but the world adjusts. But in solar photovoltaic cells, there's no equivalent substitute. Not yet. Silver's unique combination of electrical conductivity and resistance to oxidation can't be fully replicated by cheaper metals. Copper corrodes too quickly under UV exposure. Aluminum doesn't conduct efficiently enough for high-performance panels. Engineers are working on alternatives: copper-coated contacts, graphene composites, novel alloys. But none have reached commercial scale. Lab prototypes are one thing. Manufacturing billions of panels per year with new materials is entirely different. In military and aerospace applications, substitution isn't even on the table. Reliability under extreme conditions is paramount. When a weapon system or satellite depends on electrical contacts that absolutely cannot fail, silver is specified. Period. There's no acceptable alternative when failure means mission compromise or loss of life. So what actually happens when a critical material enters structural scarcity? First, prices adjust, but not linearly or predictably. Silver markets are small. Annual global production is worth roughly $25 billion compared to gold's $200 billion or copper's $300 billion. A relatively modest shift in demand or supply can create enormous volatility. Price spikes don't just affect manufacturers. They cascade through supply chains. Solar panel costs rise, EV prices increase, electronics become more expensive. The industries driving the green transition, the ones we've collectively decided are essential, face margin compression or must pass costs to consumers. Second, industries begin competing for allocation. Solar manufacturers against EV producers, consumer electronics firms against defense contractors, medical device companies against industrial users. Those with long-term supply contracts win. Those without, particularly smaller manufacturers or new entrants, get priced out or face supply disruptions. Third, governments intervene. History is clear on this point. When materials become strategically critical, markets give way to policy. Strategic metals have consistently triggered government responses: export controls, stockpiling programs, subsidies for domestic production, diplomatic pressure to secure supply chains. China, which controls roughly 15% of global silver refining capacity and dominates solar panel manufacturing, has already demonstrated willingness to restrict exports of other critical metals: gallium, germanium, rare earths. Silver could follow the same playbook. The United States, European Union, and Japan have all launched critical minerals initiatives in recent years, explicitly naming silver among strategic materials. When governments start hoarding, markets stop functioning normally. Who benefits from this shift? Producers with existing reserves and operational mines, countries with domestic silver deposits, Mexico, Peru, China, Australia, Chile, entities that built strategic stockpiles before scarcity became obvious. Who absorbs the cost? Industries dependent on stable, affordable supply, companies without bargaining power, consumers facing higher prices for everything from solar panels to smartphones to medical equipment, and nations without secure access to supply chains, locked out of the materials that define modern infrastructure and economic competitiveness. This isn't hypothetical. It's the pattern that plays out every time a commodity transitions from abundant to scarce. This isn't ultimately a story about silver. It's a story about what happens when the pace of technological transition outstrips the pace of resource development. For decades, the prevailing assumption was simple: markets adapt, prices signal scarcity, high prices incentivize exploration and production, supply responds, equilibrium restores itself. That logic works for many commodities, but it breaks down when geology imposes hard constraints. Resource extraction doesn't move at the speed of policy ambitions or technological adoption curves. You can't accelerate ore formation. You can't will new deposits into existence. And you can't compress a 15-year mine development timeline into 5 years, no matter how much capital you deploy. Ore grades are declining worldwide. The highest quality, easiest to access deposits were found and exploited first. What remains requires more energy, more water, deeper drilling, more complex metallurgy. And when a material becomes simultaneously critical to national security and economic competitiveness, the incentives fundamentally shift, from market dynamics to strategic control, from price discovery to allocation by geopolitical power. We've seen this movie before: oil in the 1970s, rare earth elements in the 2010s, semiconductor chips in the 2020s. Each time, the world was caught off guard. Each time, the assumption was that supply would somehow materialize when needed. Each time, reality proved otherwise. History doesn't repeat events, it repeats incentives. And the incentive to secure critical resources, before competitors do, has shaped more geopolitical outcomes than most people realize. The silver story is unfolding in real time. The deficit is measurable, the stockpile drawdown is documented, the demand trajectory is clear. What remains uncertain is how quickly the world realizes what is happening, and how governments and industries respond when they do. Because once scarcity becomes undeniable, the competition stops being economic. It becomes existential. Here's what we know with certainty. Systems built on the assumption of abundant resources behave predictably until abundance ends. And human institutions, whether markets or governments, rarely adapt before scarcity becomes visible and undeniable. The mechanisms of resource depletion aren't mysterious. They're mechanical, predictable, and historically consistent. High-grade deposits get exhausted, replacement reserves become harder to find, development timelines lengthen, costs rise, and eventually, Geology imposes limits that no amount of capital or technology can overcome, at least not quickly enough. What makes silver unique is its dual nature. It's an industrial metal that the modern world cannot function without. And it's a monetary metal with thousands of years of history as a store of value. When industrial users compete with investors and governments for a finite supply, the dynamics become unpredictable. Some analysts believe silver prices could multiply several times over in the next decade as scarcity becomes apparent. Others argue that high prices will solve the problem, incentivizing dramatic increases in recycling, substitution, and exploration. Both might be right, or both might be missing the real point. Because the deeper story isn't about price, it's about dependency. The modern world has made a collective bet on electrification, on renewable energy, on a technological future that happens to be extraordinarily material intensive. We've committed to that future before ensuring we can actually supply it. And silver is just one material among many facing the same dynamic. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earths, each critical, each facing supply constraints, each embedded in technologies we've decided are non-negotiable. The silver miners issuing warnings aren't being alarmist. They're reading geology. They're looking at reserve replacement rates and depletion curves and permitting timelines. They're recognizing what the market hasn't priced in yet, that the easy abundance of the past century was an anomaly, not a permanent condition. What happens next depends on choices being made right now. Investment decisions, policy priorities, international negotiations over resource access and supply chain security. The outcome isn't predetermined, but the constraints are real. If this hidden chapter of resource economics and the quiet mechanics of industrial dependency made you rethink how the materials beneath modern life actually work, and what it means when they start running short, hit that like button, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on notifications. Because the next story might just change how you see not only the foundations of power, but the fragility of the systems we take for granted.